Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he guided his tractor across the dusty fields of his cattle ranch in southeastern Arizona. The land had been in his family for 3 generations, passed down from his grandfather who had bought it cheap during the Great Depression. At 62 years old, Jake thought he knew every inch of these 5,000 acres, like the back of his weathered hands. The summer of 2023 had been particularly harsh. The drought was the worst anyone could remember, forcing Jake to dig new wells to keep his cattle watered. That's when everything changed. He was working on expanding an irrigation system near the old cottonwood grove when his shovel struck something that definitely wasn't rock. The metallic clang echoed across the empty field. Jake bent down and brushed away the red dirt with his gloved hands. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. Gleaming in the afternoon sun was what appeared to be a silver artifact, partially buried, and clearly very old. The craftsmanship was unlike anything he'd ever seen, with intricate patterns that seemed to dance in the light. Jake had always been a practical man, more concerned with cattle prices and rainfall than ancient history. But something about this discovery felt significant, almost sacred. He carefully excavated the object, revealing an ornate silver medallion about the size of his palm. Strange symbols covered its surface, and it was remarkably well preserved despite obviously being very old. That evening, Jake sat at his kitchen table, examining the medallion under a bright lamp. His wife Maria, a retired school teacher, was fascinated by the discovery. She had always been more interested in the historical aspects of their land than Jake, often pointing out old pottery shards and arrowheads they'd find over the years. "This looks like it could be Native American," Maria said, adjusting her reading glasses. "Maybe Apache. You know this area was their territory for centuries before the settlers came." Jake nodded, though he wasn't entirely comfortable with that thought. His grandfather had always maintained that the land was legally purchased fair and square, but Jake had heard whispers over the years about the complicated history of the region. The Apache had been forced from their ancestral lands in the late 1800s, and relationships between native communities and local ranchers had been strained ever since. The next morning, Jake decided to return to the spot where he'd found the medallion. Something told him there might be more to discover. Armed with a metal detector he'd borrowed from his neighbor, he spent hours carefully scanning the area. The detector went crazy near a cluster of large rocks about 50 yards from where he'd found the medallion. What Jake unearthed over the next several hours changed everything. Buried beneath the rocks was a cache of artifacts that took his breath away. Silver jewelry, ornate weapons, pottery, and what appeared to be ceremonial items. Each piece was more beautiful and intricate than the last. There were necklaces with turquoise stones, silver bracelets with detailed engravings, and several items that Jake couldn't even identify. As he carefully laid out the artifacts on a tarp, Jake realized he was looking at something extraordinary. This wasn't just a random collection of old items. The way they were buried together, wrapped in what remained of leather and cloth, suggested this was a deliberate cache. Someone had hidden these treasures here for a reason. Jake's excitement was mixed with growing unease. He knew enough about federal law to understand that finding Native American artifacts on your own land didn't necessarily mean you could keep them. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act meant that certain items had to be returned to their tribes of origin. But Jake also knew that this discovery could be worth a fortune to collectors. That night, he couldn't sleep. The artifacts were safely locked in his gun safe, but they seemed to call to him from across the house. Maria urged him to contact the authorities, but Jake hesitated. His ranch had been struggling financially for years. Cattle prices were down, feed costs were up, and the drought was costing him thousands in well digging and water hauling. These artifacts could solve all his problems. For 3 days, Jake wrestled with his conscience. He researched the history of the area online, learning about the Apache tribes who had lived on this land for generations. He read about Chief Cochise and Geronimo, about the Indian Wars and forced relocations. The more he learned, the more conflicted he felt. On the 4th day, Jake made a decision that would change his life forever. He loaded the artifacts into his truck and drove to the University of Arizona in Tucson, where he'd heard there were experts in Native American archaeology. Professor Sarah Whitehawk, a specialist in Apache culture and history, examined the artifacts with growing amazement. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice filled with awe. "What you've found here is absolutely unprecedented. These appear to be ceremonial items from the Chiricahua Apache, dating back to the 1,870 seconds, or 1,880 seconds. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Some of these pieces, I've never seen anything like them." Professor Whitehawk explained that the artifacts likely belonged to a medicine man or chief, given their quality and spiritual significance. The medallion that Jake had first discovered was particularly important. The symbols weren't random decorations but rather a form of Apache pictographic writing that told a story. "This medallion," she said, pointing to the intricate symbols, "appears to be describing the location of something. It's like a map, but not in any conventional sense. These symbols reference natural landmarks, celestial events, and spiritual concepts that would have been meaningful to the Apache people." Jake felt his blood run cold. "A map to what?" Professor Whitehawk shook her head. "I can't be certain without more research, but given the ceremonial nature of these other items, it could be pointing to a sacred site, a burial ground, or—" She paused, studying the medallion more closely. "Or possibly the location of additional caches like the one you found." The professor's words hit Jake like a thunderbolt. If this medallion was indeed a map to other treasure sites, the implications were staggering. He could be sitting on a discovery worth millions of dollars. But Professor Whitehawk's next words brought him back to reality. "Of course, I'll need to contact the Chiricahua Apache Nation immediately. These artifacts clearly belong to them, and federal law requires their return. This is an incredibly significant find for their cultural heritage." Jake's heart sank. He had hoped to find some legal way to keep at least some of the artifacts, or perhaps arrange some kind of finder's fee. But Professor Whitehawk made it clear that wasn't an option. The law was straightforward, and these items had to be returned to their rightful owners. That evening, Jake sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of red and gold. The weight of his decision pressed down on him. He had done the right thing by bringing the artifacts to the university, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to lose something that could have saved his ranch. Maria joined him on the porch, bringing 2 glasses of iced tea. "You did the right thing," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "Did I?" Jake asked. "We might lose the ranch?" "Maria, the bank's been calling about the mortgage. And this drought isn't ending anytime soon. Some things are more important than money," Maria replied gently. "These artifacts aren't ours. They never were." 3 days later, a delegation from the Chiricahua Apache Nation arrived at Jake's ranch. Leading them was Thomas Naicha, a direct descendant of the famous Apache chief Naicha. Thomas was a tall, serious man in his 50s, who carried himself with quiet dignity. With him were tribal elders, a cultural preservation specialist, and Dr. Elena Santos, an archaeologist who worked with the tribe. Jake had expected anger or accusations, but the Apache delegation was respectful and professional. Thomas examined the artifacts with reverence, handling each piece as if it were sacred. The elderly tribal members spoke quietly among themselves in Apache, their voices filled with emotion. "These belong to my ancestor," Thomas said finally, holding the medallion. "This is the medicine bundle of Chief Naicha, my great-great-grandfather. We thought it was lost forever when he was captured and sent to prison in Florida." The weight of history settled over the group. Jake realized he wasn't just looking at valuable artifacts, but at the sacred possessions of a man who had fought desperately to protect his people's way of life. The medallion and other items represented not just monetary value, but the spiritual heart of a culture that had been nearly destroyed. Dr. Santos carefully photographed each item while Thomas and the elders discussed their significance. The conversation was in Apache, but Jake could sense the deep emotions involved. Finally, Thomas turned to Jake with an expression that was both grateful and troubled. "Mr. Morrison, we appreciate that you brought these to the university instead of trying to sell them. But we need to discuss something important with you. This medallion, it's not just a ceremonial object. It contains information that's very dangerous in the wrong hands. Thomas Nache's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized the situation was far more complicated than he had imagined. The Apache delegation exchanged meaningful glances, and Jake sensed they were debating how much to tell him. "What kind of information?" Jake asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Dr. Santos spread a large map of the region across Jake's kitchen table. Thomas placed the medallion next to it and began pointing to specific symbols. "These markings describe locations that are sacred to our people, but they also mark places where other medicine bundles were hidden during the Indian Wars. Some of these sites contain items that should never be disturbed." Jake studied the intricate symbols on the medallion, trying to understand their significance. "You mean there are more caches like the one I found?" "Much more," said Helen Yazi, one of the tribal elders. Her voice was heavy with concern. "But not all of them contain treasure in the way you might think. Some contain items that were buried to keep them safe from those who would misuse them." Thomas carefully traced one of the symbols with his finger. "Our ancestors knew that the old ways were ending. They hid sacred objects, medicines, and knowledge to preserve them for future generations. But they also buried things that were too dangerous to let fall into the wrong hands." The room fell silent. Jake looked around at the faces of the Apache delegation and realized they were genuinely frightened about something. "What kind of dangerous things?" Dr. Santos opened a thick folder she had brought with her. "Mr. Morrison, what I'm about to tell you must remain confidential. The Chiricahua Apache had powerful medicine men who understood things that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. Some of their knowledge involved what we might call biochemical warfare." Jake felt the blood drain from his face. "I don't understand." Thomas took a deep breath before continuing. "My ancestor, Chief Naicha, worked with a medicine man named Kayetene. During the final years of the Apache Wars, when our people were being systematically exterminated, Kayetene developed weapons. Poisons derived from desert plants and minerals that could kill entire cavalry units without leaving a trace." The elderly woman, Helen, spoke softly. "The U.S. Army never understood why some of their soldiers died mysteriously in certain areas. They blamed disease, bad water, or Apache magic, but it was Kayetene's medicine, spread on the ground where the soldiers would camp." Jake's mind raced. "And you think some of these weapons might still be buried out there?" "We know they are, Doctor," Santos said grimly. "After Kayetene's death, his apprentices buried his laboratory and all his preparations. The locations were marked on this medallion so that future generations could find them if necessary, but also so they could be avoided." Thomas pointed to a symbol that looked like a twisted snake. "This mark indicates sites where dangerous medicines are buried. According to our oral histories, there are at least 3 such locations in this area. The chemical compounds Kayetene created were extremely stable. They could still be lethal after all these years." Jake felt like the world was spinning around him. What had started as an exciting treasure hunt was turning into something out of a nightmare. "So you're telling me there could be biological weapons buried on my land?" "Not just biological," Dr. Santos corrected. "Kayetene also worked with mineral poisons, mercury compounds, arsenic derivatives, things that would contaminate groundwater for generations. The Apache didn't have the scientific knowledge to understand the long-term environmental impact, but they knew these substances were incredibly dangerous." The implications hit Jake like a sledgehammer. His cattle, his wells, his entire livelihood could be at risk if any of these burial sites were disturbed. Worse, if the wrong people got hold of the medallion and used it to locate these sites, the consequences could be catastrophic. "What do you want me to do?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas leaned forward. "We need your help to locate and safely neutralize these sites before anyone else finds them. The medallion provides general locations, but we'll need to search your land methodically, and we'll need to do it quietly." "Quietly?" Dr. Santos explained. "If word gets out about what's potentially buried here, we'll have treasure hunters, extremist groups, and possibly foreign agents swarming over this area. Some of the compounds Kayatene created could be reverse-engineered into modern weapons. This is a matter of national security. Jake's head was spinning. But I found these artifacts on my own land. Don't I have some rights here? I'm not. Helen Yazzie spoke with gentle firmness. Mr. Morrison, this is bigger than property rights. These are weapons that could kill thousands of people if they fall into the wrong hands. Would you really want that on your conscience for any amount of money? The next morning, Jake woke to find 3 black SUVs parked in his driveway. Men in suits were talking quietly with Thomas and Dr. Santos near his front porch. Maria grabbed his arm as he started toward the door. Jake, what have we gotten ourselves into? She whispered. Before he could answer, one of the suited men approached. He was tall, clean-cut, and had the bearing of someone used to command. Mr. Morrison, I'm Agent David Reeves, FBI. We need to talk. The next few hours were surreal. Agent Reeves explained that the FBI had been monitoring the situation since Professor Whitehawk had reported the discovery. Apparently, the federal government had been aware for decades that Apache chemical weapons might be buried in the Southwest. But they had never been able to locate them. The tribal elders have been incredibly cooperative, Agent Reeves said. But they've made it clear that they won't help us without your full consent and participation. This is your land, Mr. Morrison. We can't just take it over, even for national security. Jake found himself in an impossible position. Federal agents were asking for his help to locate and neutralize century-old chemical weapons on his property. The Apache Nation wanted to reclaim their sacred artifacts and protect their ancestral secrets, and he was caught in the middle, facing potential financial ruin if he couldn't find a way to make this work. What's in it for me? Jake asked bluntly. I'm not trying to be greedy, but this drought is killing my ranch. If I let you tear up my land looking for these sites, what happens to my cattle operation? Agent Reeves and Thomas exchanged glances. We've been authorized to offer compensation, the agent said. The federal government will pay for any damages to your property, and there's a substantial finder's fee for helping locate sites of national security importance. How substantial? Jake asked. Enough to save your ranch and set you up for life, Agent Reeves replied. But there are conditions. You'll need to sign confidentiality agreements. This operation will be classified, and you'll need to work closely with both the tribal representatives and our hazmat teams. Jake looked at Maria, who nodded almost imperceptibly. Then he turned to Thomas. What about the Apache Nation? What do you get out of this? Thomas's expression was thoughtful. We get our sacred artifacts returned. We get to properly honor our ancestors by safely handling their dangerous legacy, and we get assurance that these weapons won't be used to harm anyone else. There's something else, Dr. Santos added. Some of the sites marked on the medallion contain more than just weapons. There are also traditional medicines, ceremonial objects, and knowledge that could be incredibly valuable to modern science. Items that could advance medical research if studied properly. The offer was tempting, but Jake sensed there was more to the story. That afternoon, while the federal agents set up their mobile command center in his barn, Thomas pulled him aside for a private conversation. Mr. Morrison, there's something the FBI doesn't know, Thomas said quietly. Something we haven't told them yet. Jake's stomach clenched. What now? The medallion doesn't just mark burial sites. It also contains information about a much larger cache, something that Kaitene and Chief Naicha buried together just before the final surrender. We call it the Heart of the Mountain. What's the Heart of the Mountain? Thomas looked toward the distant mountains, his expression grave. According to our oral traditions, it's the most sacred and dangerous thing our people ever created. Not just weapons or medicines, but something that could change the balance of power in this entire region. Something that both the Mexican and American governments were desperate to find. Jake felt the familiar chill of dread. And you think it's somewhere on my land? We're certain of it, Thomas said. And if the FBI finds out about it, they'll never let any of us leave here alive. Thomas's words hit Jake like a physical blow. The implications of what the Apache leader was telling him were staggering. He looked toward the barn where FBI agents were setting up sophisticated equipment. Then, back at Thomas's troubled face. "What exactly is this heart of the mountain?" Jake whispered. Thomas glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Our ancestors spoke of it in whispers. It's said to be a combination of ancient knowledge and something they discovered in the deepest caves of these mountains. Kaitene spent years learning from the old medicine men before the white soldiers came. He found something in those caves that gave him power over life and death." Jake's mind raced. "You're talking about some kind of supernatural artifact?" "Not supernatural," Thomas corrected. "Something real. Something physical. But something that modern science might not understand. Our oral histories describe it as a stone that could purify or poison any water source for hundreds of miles. In the right hands, it could bring life to the desert. In the wrong hands, the thought hung between them like a death sentence." Jake realized that they weren't just dealing with century-old chemical weapons anymore. They were potentially dealing with something that could affect the entire Southwest's water supply. In a region already devastated by drought, such power would be beyond valuable. It would be apocalyptic. "Why hasn't your tribe tried to find it before now?" Jake asked. Thomas's expression was pained. "Many tried. Over the generations, young warriors and medicine men have sought the heart of the mountain. Most were never seen again. Those who returned spoke of guardian spirits and cursed ground. They said the ancestors protected it with more than just hidden burial sites." That evening, Jake sat with Maria on their porch, watching the FBI's floodlights illuminate their property. The federal agents had brought in ground-penetrating radar and other sophisticated equipment. They had already identified 3 anomalous sites that matched symbols on the medallion. "This is getting out of hand," Maria said quietly. "These people are talking about things that sound like science fiction." Jake nodded. But he was thinking about the strange incidents that had occurred since he'd first discovered the medallion. His cattle had been acting strangely, refusing to graze in certain areas where they'd always been comfortable before. Several of his ranch hands had reported feeling sick after working near the cottonwood grove. And there had been the dreams. For the past week, Jake had been having vivid, disturbing dreams about Apache warriors standing guard over his land. The dreams were so realistic that he sometimes woke up expecting to see painted faces watching him from his bedroom window. Maria had been having similar dreams, though neither had mentioned them to the other until now. "You've been having the dreams too," Jake said. "It wasn't a question." Maria nodded. "They feel so real. Like someone's trying to warn us about something." The next morning brought devastating news. The FBI's preliminary tests of the first burial site had revealed something that sent Agent Reeves into a panic. The buried compounds weren't just chemically stable, they were still actively dangerous. Worse, the burial methods had created a kind of time-release system. Over the decades, trace amounts of the poisons had been slowly seeping into the groundwater. Dr. Santos delivered the news with scientific precision. "The good news is that the contamination levels aren't immediately lethal. The bad news is that they're cumulative. Anyone who's been drinking water from wells in this area for years could be at risk for serious health problems." Jake felt his world crumbling. His family had been drinking that water for 3 generations. His cattle had been drinking it. His neighbors, his friends, they were all potentially poisoned by something buried. Before any of them were born, Agent Reeves tried to be reassuring. "We can clean it up. It'll take time and money. But we have the technology to neutralize these compounds and purify the water table. That's part of why the federal compensation package is so generous." But Jake barely heard him. He was thinking about his father, who had died of a mysterious wasting disease that doctors had never been able to explain. About his grandfather's sudden death from what was called a heart attack but had never made sense to the family. About Maria's recurring health problems over the years. Thomas approached him that afternoon while the federal team was conducting tests at the second site. "The spirits are trying to tell us something," he said simply. "I don't believe in spirits," Jake replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Then believe in science," Thomas said. "Dr. Santos ran tests on the water from your well. The contamination isn't random. It's following underground paths that correspond exactly to the spiritual boundaries our ancestors described. The places they said were protected by guardian spirits are the places where the contamination is weakest. Jake stared at him. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe our ancestors knew more about groundwater flow and chemical dispersal than we gave them credit for. Maybe what we call spiritual protection was actually sophisticated environmental engineering. That evening, Thomas revealed the location of the heart of the mountain. According to the medallion's symbols, it was buried beneath the largest cottonwood tree in the grove, the same tree where Jake had been planning to dig his new well. The tree was easily 200 years old, massive and gnarled, with roots that probably extended deep into the rock below. We have to find it before the FBI does, Thomas said urgently. If the federal government gets control of something that can manipulate water sources on this scale, they'll weaponize it. They won't be able to help themselves. Jake looked toward the cottonwood grove, where FBI agents were setting up perimeter lighting. How do we get there without them seeing us? We don't sneak past them, Thomas said with a slight smile. We tell them exactly where to dig. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Thomas would reveal the location of the heart of the mountain to Agent Reeves, but he would insist on conducting a traditional Apache ceremony before the excavation. The ceremony would require privacy and would take place at night, following ancient protocols that couldn't be rushed or observed by outsiders. You want us to leave you alone with a potential weapon of mass destruction? Agent Reeves asked skeptically. You want our cooperation in finding the remaining sites? Thomas countered. This is how it has to be done. My ancestors buried this with specific spiritual protections. If those protections aren't properly acknowledged, anyone who tries to disturb the site will face consequences. Jake expected the FBI agent to laugh at the superstitious nonsense, but Reeves looked thoughtful. The contamination patterns you showed us earlier. They don't follow any logical scientific model. It's like something is actively containing the spread of these chemicals. Exactly. Dr. Santos added. Whatever the Apache buried here, they knew what they were doing. We should respect their methods. The ceremony took place 3 nights later. Jake, Maria, Thomas, and the tribal elders gathered around the ancient cottonwood tree under a moonless sky. The FBI agents had withdrawn to their command post half a mile away, though Jake suspected they had surveillance equipment monitoring the area. What happened next would stay with Jake for the rest of his life. As the Apache elders began their chanting, the tree itself seemed to respond. The massive trunk creaked and groaned, and Jake swore he could feel vibrations coming up from deep underground. The air around the tree grew thick and charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm. When Thomas finally began digging at the base of the tree, the earth came away easily, as if it had been waiting to be disturbed. 3 feet down, his shovel struck something that rang like a bell. Working together, they carefully excavated a stone box about the size of a coffin, covered in Apache symbols and sealed with some kind of natural resin. Inside the box, wrapped in perfectly preserved deerskin, was something that defied explanation. It looked like a large geode, but it pulsed with a faint inner light. The moment Thomas touched it, the contaminated groundwater began to change. Jake could actually taste the difference in the air. What is it? Maria whispered. Thomas held the strange stone reverently. It's what our ancestors found in the deep caves. They called it the heart of the mountain, because it could control water the way a heart controls blood. They learned to work with it, to use its power to bring life to the desert or to protect our people from enemies. Dr. Santos took readings with a handheld device, her eyes wide with amazement. The contamination levels are dropping rapidly. Whatever this thing is, it's actively neutralizing the chemical compounds in the groundwater. But as the stone's power spread through the area, something else happened. The Apache elders began speaking urgently in their native language, pointing toward the distant mountains. In the darkness, lights were moving, not electric lights, but something that flickered and danced like flame. We need to leave, Thomas said suddenly, his voice filled with urgency. Now. What's wrong? Jake asked, but even as he spoke, he could feel it. The air was changing, becoming thick and oppressive. The light from the stone was growing brighter, and with it came a sound like distant drums. Thomas was already rewrapping the stone and lifting it from the box. The Guardians are coming. The ones my ancestors left to protect this place. They know we've disturbed their trust. Jake helped lift the stone box, surprised by how heavy it was. As they carried it away from the cottonwood tree, he looked back and saw something that made his blood freeze. Figures were emerging from the tree itself, transparent but clearly visible in the moonlight. Apache warriors in traditional dress, their faces painted for war. "Don't look back," Thomas commanded. "Just keep moving." They made it to Jake's truck, just as the FBI's floodlights suddenly flickered and went out. In the darkness, Agent Reeves's radio crackled with confused reports. Equipment was malfunctioning, vehicles wouldn't start, and several agents reported seeing figures moving through the shadows. Thomas placed the wrapped stone in the truck bed and turned to Jake with an expression of profound sadness. "This is where we part ways, Mr. Morrison. The heart of the mountain goes back to my people, where it belongs. But you've earned the right to know the truth about your land." "What truth?" Jake asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "This entire ranch sits on what our ancestors considered the most sacred ground in the region. Every generation of your family that's lived here has been serving as guardians, whether they knew it or not. The spirits chose your grandfather to buy this land. They chose your father to protect it. And they chose you to find the medallion when the time was right." Jake felt the weight of generations settling on his shoulders. "So, what happens now?" Thomas smiled for the first time since Jake had met him. "Now you accept the federal government's compensation for the cleanup and keep your ranch. But you also accept the responsibility that comes with it. This land will always need guardians." 6 months later, Jake stood in the same spot where he'd first discovered the medallion. The FBI had finished their cleanup operation, neutralizing the buried chemical weapons and purifying the contaminated groundwater. The federal compensation had indeed saved his ranch and provided enough money to last several lifetimes. But more importantly, Jake had found his purpose. Working with the Chiricahua Apache Nation, he had established a cultural preservation center on his land. The ranch now served as a place where Apache traditions could be taught and sacred sites could be protected. Tourists came to learn about Native American history, and scholars came to study the remarkable environmental engineering that ancient peoples had achieved. The medallion and other artifacts had been returned to the tribe. But Jake kept one small item, a simple stone that Thomas had given him. It looked ordinary, but Jake knew it was connected to the heart of the mountain, serving as a kind of early warning system. If anyone ever threatened the sacred sites again, the stone would let him know. Maria often joked that Jake had become part Apache himself, spending so much time learning about the culture and history of the people who had originally called this land home. But Jake knew it was more than that. He had become what he was always meant to be, a guardian of something larger than himself. The dreams had stopped, replaced by a sense of peace that Jake had never experienced before. Sometimes, on clear nights, he would see lights dancing in the distant mountains, but they no longer filled him with fear. They were a reminder that some things were more important than money, more valuable than treasure, and more enduring than any single human life. The land remembered, the spirits watched, and Jake Morrison, grandson of a Depression-era cattle rancher, had found his place in a story that stretched back hundreds of years and would continue long after he was gone.